Not too long ago, I took a deep dive into the world of Winlator on the Retroid Pocket Mini with its Snapdragon 865, and since then, its bigger sibling, the Retroid Pocket 5, has been in my hands for a bit. And ever since that last video, I've been preparing this follow-up, which will yet again take us into the world of Winlator and all that it provides. If you haven't seen that video or heard of this before, Winlator is an app that allows you to run Windows applications, namely games, on your Android device, and since both the Retroid Pocket 5 and Mini are Android-based, share the same Snapdragon 865 chipset, and are the latest and greatest handhelds from Retroid, it's no surprise that we will continue to explore its capabilities. In many ways, this video builds on the prior one and introduces an additional selection of great games that are surprisingly playable here on the Retroid Pocket 5. So, as always, I invite you to join me, Rob the Retro Tech Dad, as we dive back into the world of Winlator, complete with some new tips, settings, and examine performance this time around on the Retroid Pocket 5 as we continue to explore the world of Windows gaming on Android. So before we begin, let's go over a few things briefly. For this video, I wanted to build on my prior one that I made for the Retroid Pocket Mini. Since we have many similarities here between the Mini and the Pocket 5, it only makes sense to build on that. I highly recommend going through that video, which is a full-blown guide and will get you acquainted with Winlator, and walks you through the entire install and setup process right down to the individual settings, and will serve as the basis to get you started with Winlator. Everything in that video will allow you to get started with Winlator on the Retroid Pocket 5, and so instead, I wanted to focus on some new things that I didn't get a chance to cover in that original video. It's important to note that Winlator 8.0 has received its first revision, which is downloadable straight from the GitHub page, and of course I will have it linked down in the description area, but that does not change anything for the install, setup, or even the tips that I provide in that video. One thing that I really wanted to cover, but I didn't want to overwhelm anyone with, was to make use of your external storage with a micro SD card. This is incredibly useful since we will be covering games that are significantly larger than the ones I talked about in the RP Mini Winlator video. This portion assumes that you have already installed Winlator and have your first container up and running, which is where we will pick up. Before we deal with Winlator, we will need an additional app from the Play Store. The built-in file manager on Android doesn't provide enough information since we need to obtain the device ID of the external storage so that we can properly map the micro SD to Winlator. Let's head on over to Play Store and then type in RS File Manager and download the app with the same name. You can use other file manager alternatives like EX File Manager and CX File Manager, and I will have all of these linked in the description area for easy access. Once you have installed RS File Manager, go ahead and open it up, and this is a free app, so there are ads, but luckily we only needed this one time for setup purposes. Your main screen in RS File Manager should look something like this. So tap on Disk at the top, which represents your micro SD card. And now at the top, pay attention to the path name, which will say storage and then a random string of numbers and letters, which features 8 unique characters. For example, on my screen, it is 73D9-1000. But these numbers and letters will be different on your end. Write these 8 numbers down exactly as it is shown on your end, including the dash in between the set of numbers. We will need this in just a moment. And as you can see, we have the main screen of Winlator with one of my containers listed here. Let's go ahead and tap on the 3 dots on the right, which will bring up the additional options for the container. Tap on Edit, and then we will be taken to a new screen, which will allow us to edit the container. Scroll down just a little bit and then tap on the Drives tab, and here you will have your standard directory that uses your internal download folder, which can be accessed from within the Winlator desktop environment. At the bottom, we have the Add option, so let's go ahead and tap on this, which will add a new drive letter with white space in the target path. Now, unfortunately, it's not as simple as pointing to the micro SD card and mapping the directory. Instead, we will need to rely on another app to obtain the ID of your external storage, so that we can properly map it in Winlator, which is where the RS or EX File Manager app came into play. So start out by typing in the white space for the target path, which will start with a /storage and then / again as shown here on screen. After that slash, enter the string of 8 characters with a hyphen into the space. For example, my storage ID was 73D9-1000, which will look something like this after we are all done typing. Make sure to tap on Done, and then on the check mark to save these changes. Now hit on the play icon to launch into the container. And in File Explorer, you should have that newly created drive letter, which here is the letter F, and as you can see, it's showing the entire contents of my micro SD card, and now you can place your install files as well as install games straight to this micro SD card, like I've done here. And that's all there is to it. And now you've got Winlator mapped to use external storage, which is a very useful thing to have. And as I've used Winlator, I do want to reiterate some things in case you go on and explore what's possible on your own. Within Winlator, I always recommend adjusting various settings in case you might have a game that crashes a lot or fails to launch. As I mentioned in the mini video, you will want to pay attention to the turnip driver version, DXVK wrapper version, as well as change between the various Box 64 presets in advanced to test and troubleshoot between. Some games work with minimal effort and others will require some tweaking, and the purpose of my game showcase is to not only show you great games to play and check out, but also to provide some settings and tips as to how I got them running, and as I always do, I will discuss any changes I've made in order to get the games performing as you see throughout the video. Like before, I focused on games that are readily available for purchase on GOG since they are DRM free and easy to download. Not only that, but in my experience, I've had the least amount of issues with the GOG installer, and so I will continue to focus on these great GOG games that are available for sale and oftentimes at very fair prices. Finally, my default settings for all of these games will be using a target resolution of 1280 by 720, which I find to be a good resolution for compatibility with game launchers, and some games will actually not launch without that minimum resolution. For this video, I'm using the Turnip Adreno graphics driver version 24.1.0, which is the default, and the default DXVK wrapper, which is currently version 2.4.1, and a Box 64 preset of performance. I will let you know throughout the video which settings I've adjusted from my default Winlator options. All games were tested using the high performance preset with the Smart Fan option on the Retroid Pocket 5. And so, without further ado, let's get into this showcase, and we've got a really impressive game to start the showcase out with. And for my Winlator video on the Retroid Pocket Mini, I featured Alan Wake's American Nightmare, but I will admit that I knew that Alan Wake, which is the first and mainline entry in the franchise, worked quite well with Winlator and the Snapdragon 865. Surprisingly, Winlator is not the only way we can possibly enjoy this game on Android, as there is a Switch port. But in this case, I have to say that the PC version of Alan Wake fared a lot better for me and runs quite well here. In fact, it's probably one of the more stable games I've tested in general with Winlator, and it's definitely a real treat to see it running the way it is. I have Alan Wake set to use a resolution of 960 by 544 with just the default graphics driver and DX wrapper, and the Box 64 preset set to performance. And best of all, the controller works right out of the box with the Retroid Pocket 5. For this game, I have all of the settings adjusted to the lowest possible across the board for the best performance, which is quite solid. It manages to stay up there in frame rate, staying at or around 60 frames per second, which is quite impressive to say the least. It's finally time to answer the eternal question of whether the Retroid Pocket 5 can run Crysis. And yes it can. So I decided to go with Crysis Warhead, which is a bit interesting since out of all the Crysis games out there, it's the only one that has yet to be remastered or re-released in some way. Warhead is a standalone expansion that doesn't require the original game to play, but most importantly, the only way to enjoy this game is on PC, and thanks to the mighty Winlator, we can enjoy this game on our Android devices. It fares a lot better than I expected with the Snapdragon 865, with the game set to use the minimum settings. For this one, I am set to use the Compatibility Box 64 preset, which does mean we lose out on some performance, and it's a bummer because despite it almost hitting 30 frames per second at times here, when it's on the performance preset, the game will have double the frames, but I have found the performance preset to be very unstable, which unfortunately is not uncommon with Winlator. For this game, I am set again to use a 960 by 544 resolution, and everything else is using the default settings. Next up, we have another very interesting game that I feel like doesn't get a whole lot of attention nowadays. Dishonored comes to us from Arcane Studios, who are now unfortunately defunct and more recently responsible for games like Deathloop. Dishonored is about as high budget as you can get in the most positive way, with an impressive cast of voice actors, including notable actors like Michael Madsen, Carrie Fisher, and Susan Sarandon. Dishonored is a first-person game that gives you the choice as a player to go full stealth or take a more aggressive approach using your powers and abilities. The game can be fully played without ever killing an enemy. For me personally, I like to go full Rambo whenever I can, but Dishonored is a game where your actions can lead to different outcomes, which is tracked with the game's chaos system. And so as a player, you do have to make conscious choices that will impact the game's story. Dishonored has great graphics, a very interesting story, and a pretty unique setting that takes place in a Victorian England-inspired location, with some elements of steampunk and fantasy mixed in. I'm pretty blown away that Dishonored runs at all here, and does surprisingly a lot better than I expected. I did have to change the Box 64 preset to compatibility again, which is much more stable than the performance preset. Despite this, the game does maintain around 30 frames per second, using the lowest graphics setting in-game, at a resolution of 960 by 544. It just so happens we have another Bethesda published game to follow up with, and I don't think Fallout 3 needs much of an introduction. For my Retroid Pocket Mini Winlator video, I decided to feature Fallout New Vegas, which works quite well with the Snapdragon 865, and so it does seem appropriate to feature another Fallout game, and of course what better choice than Fallout 3, which likewise works very well with Winlator. This game was a pretty big deal when it came out, and to this day remains one of the most loved games ever released. Fallout 3 marked a shift for the franchise, moving away from the 2D isometric style to a 3D engine using real-time combat. It is pretty incredible to see this game running here on the Retroid Pocket 5, and it gives me flashbacks to the very first time I loaded up Fallout 3 on my Xbox 360. And it's quite amazing to see how far we've come. Fallout 3 does have a launcher, so you will need to configure your settings first through that. You can make a shortcut from the actual game exe if you want to bypass it for subsequent playthroughs. I've got Fallout 3 running here at 1280 by 720, using low settings, and for this game I did need to change the Box 64 preset to the stability option. Unfortunately, I had the game freeze up on me frequently when using the performance option, and despite this, the game does run surprisingly well with stability at the 720p resolution, mostly staying above 30 frames per second, and at many times getting close to 60 frames per second, which really is quite impressive. And speaking of impressive, yes, I have Mad Max running here on the Retroid Pocket 5 with its Snapdragon 865. And I saw this on my list of games from GOG, and I said to myself to just go for it. And I'm really glad I did, because not only do I think that Mad Max from Avalanche Studios is an awesome game, it's one that really showcases how far Winlator has come and what it's truly capable of. Mad Max released in 2015, and so it's the newest game that will be featured in this showcase. But it's not a light game in any sense, with it being open world that takes place in a post-apocalyptic wasteland made famous by the Mad Max movies. Despite it being based on a licensed property, the Mad Max game is one well worth playing through, regardless if you're a fan of the Mad Max franchise, or just want an awesome game that combines the typical open world exploration, vehicular combat, and a pretty awesome combat system that is both satisfying and brutal, and best of all, it requires no prior knowledge of the series, since it is a standalone story. Now unfortunately, the game has issues running with the Performance Box 64 preset, and out of all the options, the stability one is living up to its name by providing the most stable experience at the cost of performance. The game hits 30 frames per second at times, but will dip below that, and really it's a matter of how tolerant you are for that. I have the game set to use a resolution of 960 by 544, and of course the lowest settings possible across the board. I do recommend changing the Direct 3D setting under DirectX in the shortcut settings to use the built-in wine option, which also helps reduce crashing. Despite all of this, Mad Max will still crash randomly, and some playthrough sessions last longer than others, so keep this all in mind if you're planning on trying it out for yourself. And the hits just keep on coming, no pun intended, with Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance, and despite the Metal Gear name, is quite a departure from the usual seen in the series. Metal Gear Rising was developed by Platinum Games, the same studio responsible for well-known hits like the Bayonetta franchise, and so we see a lot of obvious signs here that this is in fact a Platinum-developed game. If you had any issues with Raiden back from Metal Gear Solid 2, consider Rising to be his redemption arc, as you get to play as Raiden, but I promise you Raiden is one very cool character that gets to show off his impressive combat abilities with the sword, and combined with the over-the-top style that Platinum is known for, makes for a very fast-paced and satisfying game to play. What's interesting about Rising is that there is a native Android version that was ported to the platform by NVIDIA Lightspeed Studios, and this was done because of their Shield line of products, and so unfortunately, that port is only compatible with the Tegra X1, the very same one found on Nintendo Switch, which surprisingly never received a port of this game. That's okay, because we don't need no stinking port. We have the next best thing here with Winlator and the GOG version of Rising that works very well using the Performance Box 64 preset, and I have the game running here at a resolution of 1280 by 720 with all the settings turned down to low, and performance really is impressive here, staying above 30 frames per second throughout most gameplay segments and is very playable here on the Retroid Pocket 5. Now this next one is a fun one that has some similarities to Pikmin, and since Nintendo doesn't want anyone talking about or showing off their games, Overlord is the next best thing, and that's okay, because on its own, Overlord is a great game that has you taking control of the Overlord, who can command small armies of mischievous, gremlin-like creatures called minions that can perform various tasks on your behalf. There are several types of these minions that are color-coded, which have different strengths and weaknesses, kinda like a certain other game. Overlord has a great sense of humor, and certainly is the antithesis to a game like Pikmin, which is bright and colorful. There's something absolutely hilarious about having a legion of enthusiastic minions obeying your commands and wanting to serve at your beck and call. Overlord is one of the older entries on this list, releasing back in 2007 for the Xbox 360 and PC, and its performance here definitely proves that since this game is easily one of the best performing out of the bunch. I have Overlord set to use a resolution of 1280 by 720, using the low settings and the Performance Box 64 preset, and the game stays up there at or close to 60 frames per second and looks really sharp and clean on the Retroid Pocket 5. And yet again, we have another game that I can't even believe is playing here on a device powered by just the Snapdragon 865. Sleeping Dogs is a real gem of a game that almost didn't happen back when it was released in 2012. Thankfully, Square Enix saved this game from the clutches of Activision, where it was originally announced as part of the True Crime series and then cancelled. Clearly a bad call by Activision, as the game re-emerged as Sleeping Dogs and has done quite well ever since. It completely blew me away back when it was released, and the first time I played this game was on the PlayStation 3. Sleeping Dogs is another open world game making the list that takes place in Hong Kong, and you play as an undercover police officer who needs to infiltrate the triad. The city is absolutely stunning and amazingly detailed, with tons of things to explore, along with a progression system that allows you to upgrade your skills, combined with an awesome combat and driving system. I'll be completely honest, I much prefer this game over something like Grand Theft Auto 4. Sleeping Dogs is another one of those games that I can't believe is running here at all, and for this game, unsurprisingly, I am set to use a 960 by 544 resolution with the lowest settings possible, and thankfully we are able to use the Performance Box 64 preset, and the game is very stable, but most importantly, it does stay above 30 frames per second during many gameplay segments, and is well worth checking out here on the Retroid Pocket 5. Now here's a game that's truly a forgotten gem, and it's hard to not pay attention when you have a studio like Raven Software behind Singularity. And really, what hasn't Raven Software dabbled in, considering they are responsible for developing games like the Heretic and Hexen series, Soldier of Fortune, Jedi Knight, and currently co-develops the Call of Duty games. This studio certainly knows a thing or two about first-person games, and Singularity is sadly the last original game they worked on, since helping out with the Call of Duty franchise. Singularity is a first-person shooter that takes place in a reimagined Cold War where Soviet advancements change the course of global history. The story is very interesting, and the gameplay has some very cool elements, including the time manipulation device that allows you to do things like age enemies, age or revert objects back to their original state, and create time bubbles that slow down the enemy or environments. And beyond all of that, Singularity features multiple endings based on the choices you make in-game. Singularity is another game that unfortunately isn't quite stable with the Performance Box 64 preset. So for this game, I recommend going with the Compatibility Box 64 preset using a resolution of 960 by 544 and the lowest settings possible. The Compatibility preset does impact performance a bit, but not as bad as I thought, and it's another game that manages to stay above 30 frames per second and is quite playable on the Retroid Pocket 5. And let's close this out with a great indie game from Jonathan Blow, the same mind behind another excellent indie game, Braid. The Witness is the newest game for this showcase and was released in 2016, and is a game that is heavily inspired by Myst, with its emphasis on exploration and puzzle solving. The game provides no instructions to the player, and trial and error is very much part of the gameplay loop here. Blow wanted to create a game around non-verbal communication, wanting players to learn from observation to find solutions, and features almost 650 different puzzles. I'm honestly shocked that this game runs as well as it does, since The Witness was moved from its original plans to release on Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, since the game engine was too demanding for those platforms. Instead, it was first released for the PlayStation 4 and PC. The Witness is a beautiful game with great art direction, and for this game I am set to use a resolution of 960 by 544 with low settings and a dynamic resolution option, while using the Performance Box 64 preset, which is stable and allows us to run this game as well as you can see here, which definitely ranges from 30 to 60 frames per second. And that does it for this video, and we have another set of games that surprisingly work here for the Retroid Pocket 5, and as a result, its smaller sibling, the Retroid Pocket Mini, thanks to the same Snapdragon 865 that they share. It's truly amazing to see how far Winlator has come and just how much we are able to get out of the older Snapdragon 865 chipset. Now, in terms of Winlator, I have no doubts that I will be returning to this topic yet again, since it's been such a joy tinkering with Winlator on various devices. But until then, as always, I am the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.